Hello and welcome to part 5 of my Holbein painting technique investigation series. This is going to be the final video that I'm going to do on this. Basically what I have left to do now is just put in the sort of final details and basically just finish off the painting and just correct any little mistakes or just add little details and stuff, so we're nearly finished. So up to now I've been following the techniques of Jan van Eyck laid down in this book, but what I'm trying to do is follow the techniques more of Holbein. Now this book doesn't mention all the techniques that Holbein would have used. Basically I was following Van Eyck's techniques because they were sort of similar to the ones that Holbein were using, but Holbein had his own techniques which were sort of singular to him, and this book does lay down some of these techniques, most notably around the painting of the hair and sort of beards and fur and things like that. So in the book it says Holbein built up his pictures very differently. When he wanted to paint a beard or hair, he first painted the total effect in correct light and shadows, and then he put in details liquidly and perfectly, whereas others built up their pictures by beginning with a drawing followed by successive and alternating glazes over forms developed plastically with white. So I think this basically means that he sort of just built up the colours, or he just painted the colours of the hair. So here I've just done kind of quite basic shapes of the hair and put in some shadows and the highlights. But then I think what he did was, once that was all finished, he then went in and sort of drew the individual hairs and sort of maybe like individual strands and things like that. And also I think it's worth noting as well that it was unlikely that he painted these little strands in oil paint. I think what he did was he painted them in tempera. Now the way I think he would have painted these in tempera is that he used a sort of special technique whereby he selected an area which he wanted to paint first and then painted a very, very thin layer of varnish over the painting, and then while the varnish was still wet he painted in tempera into the varnish, and then as the varnish dried it sort of fused with the tempera, making it making the tempera dry with the varnish. I think it's better if I sort of show you what I think he was doing rather than try to describe you, because I think that would make more sense. So let's get to that then. Now before we start painting, I thought I'd just do a quick recipe of the varnish that I'm going to be using. This is sort of a Venetian turpentine based varnish, which I think was used by Van Eyck and the sort of Flemish painters at the time. Basically what it is you get some pure Venetian turpentine, which I have here. And now this is a resin that's extracted from the larch tree, and it's in its pure form it's very thick and resinous. It's kind of like very, very, very thick honey. Now we can't work with this in its current state, so what we have to do is mix it up with some balsam turpentine, which I have here, and it's a simple recipe. It's just 1 part Venetian turpentine to 1 part turpentine, and what you do is just mix them both in a bowl and then just gently heat it up until the Venetian turpentine sort of melts into the balsam turpentine. Then you get this sort of brownish mixture. So that's the varnish. So now I have my varnish ready. What I want to do is just get a soft brush and pick an area which I want to paint. In this case it's just part of her hair, and I want to apply a very, very thin layer of the Venetian turpentine varnish. So now I've applied the varnish, I just want to take a white brush, in this case it's a rigger brush, and then load it up with the Tempera colour of my choice. In this case it's burnt umber, and what I want to do is just paint very thin strands of the Tempera paint into the still wet varnish. Now the idea is that when the varnish starts to dry, with the Tempera lines in it, it sort of contracts the pigment even further, so the lines painted get even thinner. So this is very good if you're wanting to do very fine hairs or very, very fine detail, or the rigging of a ship as well. This is actually why the brush is called a rigger, because it was used to paint rigging on sort of nautical scenes of ships and stuff like that. And what this technique also does is it slightly softens the edges of the Tempera, because Tempera on its own, it normally has very, very hard and quite harsh edge, and it doesn't quite go well if you're painting over oil paint, which traditionally has sort of softer edges. So it kind of disguises the fact that you're actually painting in Tempera. It gives it a very sort of slightly softer edge, which helps it sort of blend in better with the previous oil layer. So you can see here again, I'm just painting a very thin layer of varnish over the section of hair, and then I'm just taking my rigger again with some burnt umber Tempera, and just painting these very, very, very thin lines to represent sort of individual strands of hair. So in this part here, I'm just painting the left eyebrow, so you might be able to see a little bit better how it works. So I first apply just a thin coating of the varnish, and then I get my rigger brush and I just do very, very faint lines. Another advantage of painting Tempera paint directly into varnish is that you can see how the Tempera paint will look when it is eventually varnished, when you decide to varnish the picture at the end. The thing is, Tempera paint, when it's varnished, it normally goes quite a bit darker than how it looked before it was varnished. So if you're actually painting the Tempera into the varnish, you can see kind of immediately how the end result will be once you actually varnish the whole picture. You might also see as well some of the strands of hair I painted on the right hand side appear quite matte, not as glossy as the rest of the hair. I think this is because when I was painting these strands, the varnish that I'd applied had already started to dry, so it wasn't quite caught by the varnish. So you have to be quite quick in applying these strands. So you can see here as well, I'm doing the eyelashes, very, very, very fine lines. And this, I think, is the real advantage of using Tempera instead of oil paint, because you wouldn't really be able to get this kind of accuracy and precision with oil paint. You'd have to water it down with quite a lot of medium, then it would start to get quite wet. But with the Tempera and the sort of varnish combo, it seems to work really well. Now for the pearls, I'm still using the rigger brush, which is kind of the finest brush I own, but honestly, I think if you made the tempera paint just the right consistency, you can actually use a very fine pen to actually apply the tempera. I've done it before. You can use it just like an ink, really, if you get it to the right consistency. So then you could do very, very fine details if you wanted to. Now for this gold ring, I go back to using oil paints. So what I do is I first give it a very thin glaze in Indian yellow to give it a sort of golden tint, and then I just basically apply little highlights and little shadows just to complete the ring. Now I'm using oils in this case to apply the sort of fine details, but looking back, I think you could even use tempera, because basically the glaze that I applied over the ring it's basically just varnish with a little bit of pigment added to it. So after applying the glaze, you could then just go straight in with some tempera paint while the glaze is still wet. I mean, it works the same way. So you can see here I'm just applying just the little strands of fur on the fur cap. Now I kind of rather rushed through this part, and I don't think I did it as well as I could have. I think the main reason was because I felt under a bit of time pressure to get all the sort of necessary details down before the layer of varnish dried. So this is kind of a problem I've noticed with this technique, is that you kind of have to pick your areas wisely and make sure you don't try and do too big an area, because you have this kind of time pressure with the drying of the varnish. So if you see here, I'm applying these highlights here, and I think by the time I was applying these highlights, the varnish had sort of pretty much dried, so it was kind of behaving a little bit differently, and the sort of the edges of the dashes were a little bit harsher, and they weren't as soft as the previous ones. Now for this part of the painting, I decided not to add a layer of varnish before I started applying the tempera paint. This was because I thought the area that I wanted to paint was just a bit too large, and I think if I had applied the varnish to such a large area, I think the varnish would have dried before I managed to paint all the details in tempera first. Now, as a result of this, I could see that the edges of the tempera I was applying they definitely stood out a little bit more. They weren't blending in as much with the previous layer of oil paint. Now, after a bit of thought, I think a solution to this would be to add a bit of linseed oil or stand oil to the varnish mixture. So instead of it just being the Venetian turpentine and the regular turpentine, I'd add a little bit of stand oil or linseed oil, which would slow the drying time and I think allow me to cover larger areas and still have time to apply all the tempera before the varnish dries. just applying a little bit more this grey tempera over the previous tempera that I did before. The idea is just I want to try and soften up some of the harsher lines that I did in the sort of grey tempera beforehand. Again, I'm not using a layer of varnish beforehand, I'm just painting the tempera straight on. Now, after applying the grey tempera, I thought some of the areas were a little bit too light, so I took some ivory black oil paint and just applied it to some of the areas just to darken it up a little bit more. So these are just the final couple of strands of hair that need painting. Again, here I'm just using the varnish and tempera technique just to get the nice sort of slightly softened lines, and then that's pretty much all the painting now finished. Now once I've done that, all I need to do is just let the paint dry for about a couple of days, and then I'll be applying the final layer of retouching varnish. Now, the retouching varnish is applied to the whole painting, and it kind of serves two purposes. The first purpose is to protect the painting as it dries. The retouching varnish it's not like a full varnish. It's still quite sort of semi-porous, so it allows air through the varnish onto the surface below, allowing it to dry whilst also protecting it. Now, the second purpose is basically to equal out the sort of glossiness of the painting. The idea is that some parts of the painting are sort of a bit more matte, while others are kind of glossy, and other parts of the area, especially like sort of the black areas, they've kind of sunk in, as it were, so they've kind of lost their luster, and with that some of the details or subtle details are lost. So when you apply this glossy layer, it sort of brings back all the luster of the painting, and it's all sort of united under one sort of level of gloss. And what I also noticed as well is that the varnish darkened to some degree the tempera paint that I'd applied in the previous layer. So it might be that after you've applied this retouching varnish, you might need to brighten up some of the tempera colours somewhat to get the final result. Okay, now that is the painting pretty much finished. There's nothing really left to do except wait 6 months till it's fully dry, and then I can apply a proper varnish, and then it will be finished, ready for framing or whatever I choose to do with it. I'm pretty pleased with how it went. I think if I did it again, knowing what I know now, I'd probably do it a bit better, but I think that's true of anything when you're trying to learn something. I think as well I'd change a few things. If I did it again, I'd definitely use flake white for the underpainting instead of the zinc white that I used. I think I'd like to experiment maybe a bit more with some of the different varnishes I could be using. But no, I think once I've done the technique and sort of followed it as best I could, it all makes sense, really. I mean, you can see why they did it and why the old masters like Holbein and Van Eyck used them. Now, would I recommend this technique to a modern painter? I'm not sure, really. It's quite labour intensive, especially making the gesso board. But I think there are techniques I think which would be useful, especially using Tempera as the underpainting because it dries very quickly. Also, I think as well, using Tempera sort of when you're doing the final details as well, I think is quite a useful technique, especially if you're doing quite fine details. Because I think the nature of the Tempera paint, it makes it very suited for sort of clean line sort of painting, something that you can't quite get with oil paints. For example, like when I was doing the pearls and things like that, or the eyebrows, the Tempera paint worked really well in painting these very fine, exact details. Anything else I'd like to say about it? I think I'd like to just try this technique a few more times with some different pictures before I really get a sort of idea of whether I'd like to continue painting this style. I guess if you want your paintings to look like such old masters as Holbein or Van Eyck, then definitely use this technique, because I think it would be the surefirest way to make your paintings look exactly like them if you're using the exact techniques that they used. But apart from that, I think that's really all I've got to say. I just want to thank everyone who's made it this far as well, watching this entire series. I think for my next videos I'm going to do more condensed videos. I think this series has gone on a little bit too long, and I'm going to try and condense the essential techniques into my videos a bit more without having too much sort of unnecessary info. But yeah, so this concludes the Holbein experiment. Pretty successful, I'd say. Learned a lot on the way, and I hope you did as well. So I'll see you again for the next video, whatever that will be. Okay, bye-bye now.